The federal government will unveil laws today aimed at forcing telcos and tech giants to hand over information about suspected criminals such as terrorists and paedophiles. The Minister for Law Enforcement, Angus Taylor, says new powers will help ASIO and the federal police monitor the phones of suspects, and there'll be changes to the search warrants regime. The minister says the laws won't force tech giants Google and Facebook to create a backdoor to bypass the encryption on messaging apps. The legislation is expected to be introduced by the end of the year. But with more on this, here's Fergus Hanson, who is the head of the International Cyber Policy Centre at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Fergus, welcome. What do you make of these proposed laws?
Well, compared to what we were led to believe, that the government was going to be somehow breaking end-to-end encryption, these laws are much more nuanced. Instead of creating systemic vulnerabilities, they tend to go after much more targeted efforts. So they're going after individuals rather than removing end-to-end encryption or creating vulnerabilities that weaken protections for all of us. So in that sense, it's very positive compared to what early reports indicated.
So under these new laws then, what will change when security authorities want to access a suspect's phone or online account?
Well, what these laws provide for is a sliding scale, I suppose, of cooperation, where tech companies have to cooperate with the government. So there's a voluntary right, so companies can cooperate if they choose to, and then there's some compulsory mechanisms. And there's two different nuances here. One is if a company already has a capability, and a more draconian version is to force them to develop a capability if they don't have it. So if a company says it can't provide content to people, to the law enforcement, for example, it can be compelled to develop that capability so it can cooperate. That's where this law, the rubber hits the road with this law.
So when you say develop the capability, that means technologically they can't break into someone's account?
So at the moment, companies could argue, well, we can't, because of end-to-end encryption or the way our devices are configured, we can't actually gain access to individuals' content. So they could be forced to develop a capability so that they can in fact do that and that they can hand that over to law enforcement with a warrant.
And Fergus, have there been many cases where authorities have been unable to fully investigate serious crimes because they can't gain access to someone's online data because of the obstruction of a tech giant?
Well, this is becoming a big issue for law enforcement. So the AFP at the moment claims that over 90% of cases that it's investigating involve some type of encryption, because encryption has just become ubiquitous. If you send a message over WhatsApp, it's automatically encrypted end to end. So this is the sort of going dark phenomena, and law enforcement around the world is coming up against this problem. And what this law tries to do is create alternative ways to access content without actually breaking encryption in the first place.
And on the other side then, Fergus, have many suspects taken a 6-month mandatory sentence just to avoid further investigation of their online data, which could potentially put them in more trouble?
Well, that's right. At the moment, if you're accused of a particularly bad crime and you're asked by police or compelled by them to open your phone, if you refuse, you only receive a 6-month sentence, for example. Now, for some people who have committed serious offences, that can be a better option than what might happen if all of their content was exposed to law enforcement. So under these changes, that imprisonment term will increase to 5 years or 10 years, depending on the severity of the offence, creating an incentive for criminals to cooperate.
So do you anticipate now with these new laws that tech companies will be flooded with requests from security agencies?
I think initially there will be quite a few requests to tech companies. The big question will be to what extent they want to cooperate and to what extent they push back against this legislation. So under some of the provisions, for example, the tech companies are asked to provide their source code, which I could imagine some of them would have some serious issues with.
And how would you describe the balance between these new laws and civil liberties?
Well, there's a huge amount to get through in the bill. There are several hundred pages of notes and explanatory memorandums, so I'm still working my way through all the detail. But I think what this law does is tries to protect against creating systemic vulnerabilities, and that's a very good thing, and focus much more on tailored access. I'm sure there's ways this bill can be improved, but I think at the big picture level, that's at least a very positive development.
Fergus Hanson, thanks.